"You're not even a real granddaughter," my father snapped, his face contorted with rage. "Only blood relatives deserve the family fortune." I froze, unsure how to react. My grandmother, Eleanor Blackwell, had been buried only 3 days ago, and here I was, witnessing the destruction of what was left of our family. The mansion, with its heavy oak shelves and leather-bound classics, now seemed a silent witness to the cruelty unfolding before me. "What are you talking about?" I managed to control my voice, barely audible over the thunder of my heart. My father stepped forward, his step firm and menacing, his eyes glittering with contempt. "Don't play innocent, Jennifer. Your mother's little secret isn't so secret anymore." He stopped in front of the formal portrait of my grandmother that hung above the fireplace, then continued, "Once the lawyer confirms that you are not of Blackwell blood, you will get nothing." I glared at him defiantly and tried to maintain my composure. "Do you promise that only blood relatives will inherit?" he asked, with the authority he had always held over our family. "Absolutely," he replied, lifting his chin in the same imperious gesture I had seen him use throughout my childhood. "I will ensure that the family legacy remains with the true Blackwells, not with imposters." I was stunned. I was 27 years old and, until that moment, I had believed that Douglas Blackwell was my biological father. Now, in my grandmother's mansion in Philadelphia, I was discovering that this truth was nothing more than a lie. What I wanted most at that moment was one simple thing: justice. The justice that my grandmother had intended in her will, specifically naming me as her only granddaughter. But I knew that the battle would not be easy. My father, who had always looked at me with veiled contempt, was not going to make it easy. He had been the man whose approval I had spent decades trying to win, without success. "You can attend the reading of the will next week if you need to," he said, with a disdain that cut through me like a knife. "But don't expect anything. I've already spoken to Harrison about challenging any provisions that include you." Harrison Mills, our family lawyer and my father's longtime friend, seemed to be in cahoots to ensure that I was excluded from everything. I didn't know who to trust anymore. My grandmother, who had always been so kind to me, had passed away, and I was now alone in facing a devastating truth. I glanced at my phone, which vibrated in my hands. A message from my mother: "We need to talk about your father tonight." What did that mean? If my father wasn't my biological father, who was he, and why was this secret coming to light now, just days before the reading of the will? It was the beginning of a journey that would make me question everything. Growing up as a Blackwell meant living under the weight of expectations and privilege. The family fortune, built on investments and pharmaceutical patents, had sustained 3 generations of luxury and power. But now I found myself in the middle of a fight I hadn't asked for, against a man who should have been my protector but who had, in fact, treated me like a stranger. What he didn't know was that, as he tried to destroy me, something inside me was changing. It wasn't about the inheritance anymore. It was about knowing who I really was. My grandfather, always so rigid and obstinate in his view of the family legacy, had never understood my desire to follow my own path. In fact, he himself had never had the courage to go beyond the expectations of his name. Unlike him, my Uncle James rejected that rigid view. Unable to accept the idea of living in the shadow of the Blackwell legacy, he left for Seattle, where he devoted himself to medical research, returning only for important family events. My memories of Uncle James were limited but extremely warm. He always treated me with genuine affection, laughing easily, giving me thoughtful gestures, and most of all, treating me as if my opinion mattered, something rare within my family. The lack of a true connection with my father only made me miss him even more. Douglas Blackwell, my father, was the kind of man who measured people's worth based on their achievements and status. Our relationship was always strained, as if I were constantly trying to fit into a mold that wasn't mine. My brothers, Thomas and William, fit his bill perfectly. Thomas, with his business acumen, and William, with his brilliance in law school, were the epitome of what he expected of a Blackwell. I, on the other hand, disappointed him at every turn. "She doesn't have the Blackwell drive," he would whisper to my mother when he thought I couldn't hear. No matter how hard I tried, whether it was excelling in college or building a promising career in historic preservation, it seemed like nothing I did was good enough. The pain of constant disappointment made me believe that the problem was my being a woman or his unrealistic expectations of me. I never imagined that the real reason for the distance between us was rooted in something deeper. My grandmother, Eleanor Blackwell, however, was always my refuge. Unlike my father, she valued my passions. She encouraged me to follow a path that was my own, not one that had been laid out by generations of Blackwells. During my undergraduate years, I would spend Sundays with her, drinking tea and listening to her stories about her family and her own quiet rebellions against the restrictions placed on women of her generation. "Remember, Jennifer," she would always tell me, "a Blackwell makes her own way." She died peacefully at the age of 86, but she left a huge void. I was still trying to navigate a life where my greatest advocate was gone, and the knowledge that I had lost the one person who truly believed in me made her absence all the more profound. In the days following my grandmother's funeral, something changed in my father's demeanor. He became more vigilant, his scrutinizing glances became more frequent, and conversations with Harrison Mills, the family attorney, began to be interrupted whenever I entered a room. They tried to convince me that this was simply grief manifesting itself in different ways, but something seemed much more sinister. The last time I saw my grandmother alive, she held my hand with unexpected strength and whispered, "Trust your instincts, Jennifer, not everything is as it seems." At the time, I thought her cryptic words were simply the result of fatigue or medication. Now, I wondered if she was trying to prepare me for what was to come, for the approaching storm that threatened to destroy what was left of our family. As I left my grandmother's office and went to find my mother, a sense of unease settled over me. Something was about to reveal itself, something bigger and more complex than I could understand at the time. My mother was waiting for me in her favorite cafe, a quiet, unobtrusive place where I could talk without interruption. She looked smaller, her eyes tired, as if the weight of it all had finally caught up with her. Her fingers nervously twisted her wedding ring, as if she were preparing to say something that would change my life. "I never wanted you to find out about this, Jennifer," she began bluntly, her voice low and measured. "Your father, Douglas, shouldn't have told you that way. It was cruel and selfish." "So it's true." My voice trailed off, barely above a whisper. "He's not my biological father?" My mother nodded, and tears began to well in her eyes. "It's complicated, Jennifer. More complicated than Douglas makes it seem." Over the next hour, my mother unraveled a story that would come to shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. She and my Uncle James, before I met my father, had been in love, young and planning a future together, until James received a research fellowship in Seattle. "We agreed he should go," my mother explained. "It was an incredible opportunity. We thought the distance wouldn't affect us, but the separation ended up damaging our relationship. During a difficult period, I grew closer to Douglas, who had always admired me from afar. And so, the truth was finally coming out. What my grandmother had known, what she had always known, was now about to change everything. My family's history had never been what it seemed. I was only just beginning to understand the depths of what had been hidden for so long. My mother's vulnerability led to a brief affair, an emotional slip-up that she ended once she realized her heart still belonged to James. When she discovered she was pregnant, she was certain the child was James's. The timing could not be ignored. Her last visit to our home lined up perfectly with the pregnancy. My mother's voice shook as she told her story, but at that moment Douglas insisted the child was his. He claimed James was engaged to someone else and didn't want to disrupt his new life. Douglas proposed marriage immediately, as if that were the honorable solution, but it was only later that my mother realized that his interest had never really been in her. "The Blackwell fortune has strict inheritance rules," she explained bitterly. "He needed a legitimate wife and children to secure his position. And I needed stability for my baby. At the time, it seemed the best option." Years passed, and the secret remained buried, with James returning to Philadelphia with his wife but no children. When their marriage ended in divorce, James withdrew even further from family affairs, devoting himself entirely to medical research. Sometimes my mother wondered if James had ever known of his existence, but she always denied the idea. "No," she whispered one day, "I couldn't disrupt his life again." And as time went on, it seemed more and more cruel to reveal the truth. Her words echoed in my mind as I tried to process the magnitude of everything that was being revealed. Every memory from my childhood would need to be re-examined. My father's cold detachment, my Uncle James's kindness and warmth on rare visits, the attention my grandmother, Eleanor, had always given me. It all seemed to make sense now, but one crucial question remained. Why was Douglas revealing this now? It was my mother who answered, her expression hardening as she spoke. He's doing this because of your grandmother's wishes. He's always been obsessed with the Blackwell fortune, and now he's worried that Eleanor left a significant portion of it to you. He needs to discredit her claim. The revelation came as a shock, but one sentence my mother said immediately hit me like a punch in the gut. You're a Blackwell by blood, just not Douglas' daughter. You're James' daughter, which makes you Eleanor's granddaughter. By blood. The irony seemed surreal. My father's attempt to exclude me from the inheritance by denying our biological connection might actually strengthen my claim through a different branch of the family tree. Everything he'd done, everything he'd tried, now seemed like just another misstep. Those words swirled through my mind, each one having the power to change my life forever. What do I do now? I asked, my voice thick with uncertainty, feeling adrift in this new reality. My mother reached across the table and took mine, offering a silent connection, a firm hold. That's up to you, Jennifer. What do you want? Recognition? Justice? Or simply your fair share of what Eleanor intended for you? I didn't have an immediate answer. The betrayal was too fresh, and the implications of everything that was happening were too vast to process all at once. But as we left the cafe, a certainty began to crystallize in my mind. I would not allow Douglas Blackwell to rewrite my story, just for financial gain. I was more than he wanted me to believe. I was a Blackwell by blood. And in the end, that meant more than any inheritance. The question now was how to prove my true parentage before the reading of the will, and more importantly, whether that truth would help or hurt my position in the complex rules of Blackwell inheritance. The next morning, I drove to Uncle James's apartment with my heart pounding, hammering in my ribs. I'd called ahead, keeping the reason vague, family matters to discuss before the reading of the will. Now, sitting in his modest living room, surrounded by scientific journals and travel mementos, I struggled to find the right words to turn his world upside down, just as mine already had. You look troubled, Jennifer, he observed, setting 2 cups of tea on the coffee table. At 58, James Blackwell was still handsome, with the same dark eyes I saw in the mirror every morning. Is Douglas making things difficult about Eleanor's estate? It's more complicated than that, I began, then hesitated. How do you ask a man if he might be your biological father? Uncle James, you and my mother, were you together before she married your father? His cup froze mid-sip, his lips ceasing to move. His expression changed from surprise to wariness. Why are you asking about this now? Because Douglas informed me that he is not my biological father, I said. And he is using that to challenge my place in Grandma's will. James set the cup down carefully, deliberately, as if the weight of the words had made the air thick. He studied my face with new intensity. What did your mother tell you? I recounted my mother's revelations about her relationship with James, watching his expressions, which alternated between the pain of nostalgia and something that looked very much like regret. I hope I never knew, he said finally, his voice heavy. Catherine never told me she was pregnant. By the time I found out about the marriage, it was already done. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on mine. Jennifer, are you saying you believe I might be your father? The timing seemed to fit perfectly with the timeline my mother had told me, but I knew the biggest obstacle now would be Douglas. Yes, I said. But Douglas is determined to prove that I have no Blackwell blood, so that I will not be entitled to the inheritance. James's expression darkened. Eleanor's will mentions you by name. Douglas can't just throw you out. He believes he can challenge any provision involving you, claiming that his grandmother believed you were his biological daughter. James stood abruptly, pacing the small room. This is absurd. Even if you are not Douglas's biological son, you are still Eleanor's granddaughter. If you are my daughter, you are entitled to the inheritance. Let's confirm that once and for all. He stopped, turning to face me directly. We need to know for sure. A DNA test would settle the matter. The simplicity of his solution both relieved and terrified me. Would you be willing to take a test? Without hesitation, he replied, I've always felt a connection to you that I couldn't explain. If you're my daughter. His voice trailed off for a moment, and then he resumed with more determination. Well, let's get the facts straight before we go any further. We arranged for rapid testing that same day, with a private lab that promised results within 72 hours. Plenty of time before the will was read. Whatever was revealed was now out of our hands. The fate of my life and the Blackwell fortune was about to be decided, and the truth, however uncomfortable, seemed to be the only thing that could give me control of the situation. As we sent off our samples, a strange combination of dread and anticipation settled in my stomach. Whatever the outcome, I knew my relationship with both men would be irrevocably altered. While I awaited the results, I tried to gather as much information as I could about my grandmother's will. I contacted her personal attorney, Bernard Walsh, who was separate from the family attorney, Harrison Mills. I'm afraid I can't discuss the specific provisions until the official reading, Bernard explained when I visited him in his office. But I can assure you that your grandmother was sane and very clear about her intentions. I asked directly about my paternity, and Bernard's carefully neutral expression momentarily disappeared. I can't comment on that, he said, but I will say that Eleanor Blackwell was a remarkably perceptive woman. Very little escaped her notice. That told me all I needed to know. My grandmother suspected, perhaps even confirmed, that I was James's daughter and not Douglas's. My momentary triumph evaporated, however, when I received a formal letter that evening. Harrison Mills had petitioned the court to postpone the reading of the will, pending resolution of the identity issues regarding the intended beneficiaries. Douglas was moving faster than I had anticipated, using his legal connections to buy time while he built his case against me. When I called Bernard to ask about the delay, his secretary informed me that he had been hospitalized with pneumonia and would be unavailable for an indefinite period of time. Coincidentally or not, Douglas was systematically removing my potential allies and sources of information. Without Bernard or the DNA results, I would enter the reading of the will at a significant disadvantage. That night, my mother called me in a panic. Douglas knows you met with James, she said, her voice shaking. He's furious. Jennifer, be careful. When Douglas feels threatened, he becomes dangerous. The DNA results arrived via encrypted email 2 days before the rescheduled will reading. With trembling fingers, I opened the scanned document and went straight to the conclusion, buried in the scientific terminology, probability of paternity 99.99998%. James Blackwell was, without a doubt, my biological father. I sat there, emotions flooding my body. Grief for revenge for the relationship I never had, anger for years of deception. Scientific confirmation turned an abstract possibility into a concrete reality. Douglas, the man who had coldly rejected me my entire life, was not my father. I immediately called James, who received the news with hushed emotion. I suspected it from the moment you asked, he said. I admit it. You have Catherine's smile, but those eyes. They are Blackwell's eyes. My eyes. A mother's eyes. We arranged to meet before the will reading to discuss our approach. Armed with the DNA evidence, I finally felt I had the upper hand against Douglas. Or so I thought. The tension in the room was palpable as Harrison Mills made the revelation I had been dreading. Douglas's gaze was full of triumph as he laid out the DNA results confirming his claim that I was not his biological daughter. His tone was deliberately calm, but the confidence in his expression was undeniable. She has no claim to the Blackwell inheritance, he stated with cold assurance, looking directly at me. I remained calm, but inside, frustration and anger boiled. How dare he question my identity, especially when the truth was in plain sight? James and I exchanged a silent look, and in a moment, the entire strategy we had so carefully planned seemed to slip through our fingers. I knew the game was only just beginning. Harrison, with his professional demeanor, examined the documents Douglas had brought to light. These DNA results are not enough to invalidate Jennifer's inheritance, he said with increasing seriousness. The Blackwell Trust, as you well know, requires direct descent. And Jennifer's lineage is still a matter of debate. Douglas's expression was unsatisfied, but he could not deny the truth. The complexities of the Blackwell Trust's terms were at stake, and this bloodline he insisted on defending could indeed prove to be a stumbling block for him, as well as for me. I was no stranger to the Blackwell family. My connection to Eleanor was more than pure biology. It was a tangled tale of secrecy, love, and betrayal. "Do you have any evidence other than this?" Harrison asked, his gaze never leaving Douglas's. Douglas hesitated, a moment of uncertainty cutting through his arrogant posture. "This is the only test we have." I knew the game was far from over. My own lineage was at the mercy of information Douglas had neglected or ignored for years. But the worst was yet to come. "James and I have something else to present," I said, breaking the growing silence in the room. "Douglas, you may have tried to take me out of the equation, but the truth doesn't just go away." My voice was firmer than I expected, as I felt a new strength building inside me. "The DNA results aren't the only piece of the puzzle. Our family history is much more complicated than you might think," I continued. "And my connection to Eleanor Blackwell's estate is much more solid than you'd like it to be." The murmurs around the table grew louder. What I was about to reveal would change everything. The silence in the room was deafening as Bernard Walsh read Eleanor Blackwell's letter, revealing the secret she had so carefully guarded. Each word seemed to weigh a ton, and Douglas, once so confident, was now visibly shaken. His eyes were fixed on the table, and his face paled as reality began to set in. Eleanor's letter not only confirmed the truth about his adoption, but also provided a legal twist that left Douglas out of the running for the family fortune. Eleanor's words were clear. His insistence on blood purity had backfired on him. She had welcomed him as her son, but her action in rejecting my legitimacy and that of James, now with the DNA evidence, disqualified him from any claim to the Blackwell inheritance. "You have disqualified yourself from that which you have most coveted," Bernard read, his voice firm and incisive. The accusation was direct, and the tension that had previously hung in the room now transformed into something palpable, like an electric current cutting through the air. Douglas, who until then had orchestrated every move with precision and coolness, had no answer. Eleanor's letter not only disproved him, but also took away from him what he wanted most: control over the Blackwell estate. I could feel a wave of justice taking shape. Finally, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Harrison Mills, who had been cautious until then, was now clearly disconcerted, staring at the documents before him, trying to find some loophole, some error that could alter destiny. But Eleanor's letter was clear and irrefutable. "James and Jennifer are the rightful heirs," Bernard declared authoritatively, finally closing the letter and looking around the table. The room, previously filled with tension, was now completely immersed in an ominous stillness. Douglas, unable to react immediately, tried to compose himself, but his expression already betrayed his defeat. He rose from his chair with a contained fury, but nothing could change what was on the table. To the heirs of the Blackwell Trust, according to Eleanor Blackwell's restructured will, the personal assets will be distributed according to the specific bequests, and the remainder of the estate will be passed to James Blackwell and his daughter, Jennifer Blackwell, Bernard continued, ending the reading. With these last words, the legal and family battle seemed to have come to an end. Douglas had been unmasked, and the truth about our lineage and Eleanor Blackwell's intention prevailed. The room, previously a battlefield, was now in absolute silence, with everyone processing the revelations and their implications. I looked at James, who was beside me with a calmer expression, although still charged with emotions. We knew that the fight was not just for money or material goods, but for the dignity and truth of our family history. Justice was being served, and finally, Eleanor Blackwell's memory was being honored, the way she had always wanted. Douglas, out of control, advanced to grab the documents, but Bernard, with imperturbable calm, pushed them away from his hands. The room, still tense, saw Douglas's frustration and anger boil over as he shouted, trying once again to manipulate the situation in his favor. "You promised," he accused, his desperation breaking any vestige of his facade of control. "You said that only blood relatives deserve the fortune." I looked him straight in the eye, without hesitation. "No, I corrected you. You said that. I just asked if you would keep your word on it, and you promised that you would." It was at that moment that justice lay no longer in the inheritance itself, but in the way the truth, the reality that Douglas had carefully constructed, was crumbling under the weight of his own hypocrisy. He had become so entangled in his own lies that now he could not escape. The irony was perfect. He himself had set the rules, and now he would be destroyed by them. The reading of the will unfolded like the last act of a Greek tragedy. Douglas, immersed in his despair, began storming the mansion, shouting threats of legal challenges that everyone knew were hollow. Harrison Mills, already weakened by the revelation of the adoption documents he had hidden, followed suit, his reputation now completely destroyed. My brothers, stunned by the revelations, approached me. Thomas, always the most sensitive, was the first to speak. "I had no idea about any of this," he said quietly. "All these years, the way he treated you. It makes sense now." William, with a serious expression, nodded. "For what it's worth, you've always been our sister. That hasn't changed." Their words touched me deeply, more than I expected. They, also shaped by Douglas in different ways, were now recognizing the truth. It was possible that deep down there was something good there, something worth saving. Their understanding, however, didn't make the pain of so many years go away, but it did soften the wound. My mother approached later, visibly relieved and at the same time apprehensive. "I should have told you years ago," she said, her expression full of regret. "I was just protecting you." Her voice had a weight, and although the pain was clear, I understood her reasons, what she was trying to avoid. That night, after everything had calmed down, James and I met in his grandmother's office. The room, surrounded by books and artifacts of family history, now felt like a setting where we were rewriting our own stories. He asked me what I would do next, the weight of the lost years evident in his voice. "Build something new," I replied simply. "We can't make up for lost time, but maybe we can build something better from here on out." He smiled, and in that smile, I saw something I'd never noticed before. The similarity between us was undeniable. "I'd like that very much," he said, a hopeful gleam in his eyes. As we talked, sharing stories and rediscovering connections, I felt my grandmother's presence. She was there, somehow, her wisdom and foresight still present. She knew that the truth would eventually come out, and that justice would be served without me having to take extreme measures. In the end, Douglas's downfall came not from my actions, but from his character, which was exposed under pressure. For decades, I had been made to feel like an outsider in the family, but upon reflection, I realized that the real outsider had always been him. The irony was perfect, and perhaps that was the only thing that made me smile about everything that had happened. Now, looking to the future, I realized that the greatest gift was not the material inheritance, but the fact that I finally had a father who wanted me in his life. That, without a doubt, was the best legacy I could have received.